So I wanted to provide an example of some advanced ways that you can use PyTest when you're testing your backend Python logic. In this case, I'm going to test some pandas logic, but you can really use some of these techniques for just about any type of function that you want to test. You can see in the middle here, I've got a function called PDF confirm. That's just a dummy function I set up to make things easier for me. Elsewhere in this file, I've got all the pandas logic, but I'll test that later. Here is the test case that I've set up. So let me just start by running this. So you can see I'm running down here in the lower corner, pipenv run pytest, pointing it at the backend code, and then the -k flag so that I only run the one test. So instead of running the whole test suite, especially later on, you could have hundreds of tests. It's just going to run the one test that I care about. So things will run a lot quicker. And if you saw in that function before, I had a breakpoint. We're immediately going to hit that breakpoint. And now if I print out the PDF, the pandas data frame is what people call them. You can see it actually has Maya, Brenna, Ezra. So this is that first example that I have here on line 18. And so now I can then go run all that test logic using that example that's set up. But if I hit continue, we're actually going to hit the test again, because Hypothesis will hit the same test multiple times and run that test many, many times. So in this case, you probably guessed, it's going to be the second example here, the one with Jennifer and Michael in it. So you can set up as many bespoke examples as you want, but if I hit continue again, you're like, okay, well now we're hitting the test a third time. We're out of examples, so what's going on? Well, now Hypothesis is going to keep running this test. It can actually run it hundreds of times if you want. In this case, I've put some settings on it where I've said, hey, max examples 10 on line 20 there. That's because I don't want it to run forever, especially right now where I'm kind of just debugging and I'm stepping into my own code, playing around with my own code, understanding what's going on in it. And so in this case, I don't want it to run 100 times. Oftentimes, I'll probably even set that to 1 if I'm really trying to debug some logic. But if I hit continue again, and I print again, now you'll see we've got an even different data frame. So before we had an empty data frame, now we have a data frame that has one element in it where the name's blank. So this is that one of those cool things that Hypothesis does is it'll test all the boundary cases for your logic. So if you tell it, hey, I've got a function that takes 2 floats and an integer, and I want to do a bunch of math on those things, it'll say, cool, you want a float? I'll give you negative numbers. I'll give you really big numbers, small numbers. Oh, you said you wanted a string? I'll give you special characters. It'll inject special characters in there for you. It'll test all these weird edge cases. It's not even going to like fuzz your test. It actually is smarter than that. So it's not going to throw every test case at your test. It'll intelligently pick out known failure points. And it'll even have even more advanced features than that. It'll record them. So if you get a certain failure, it'll give you a code, like a hash for that test scenario. You can actually then take that hash, put it in as an example, and say, like, look, this is a known unstable scenario for my logic. And Hypothesis will say, cool, I'll run that every time to make sure that bug you fixed never comes back. So in this case, obviously there's some logic here, like there's a data frame I'm setting up, and I'm doing using some of the Pandas plugin stuff for Hypothesis to do Pandas logic. But don't let that distract you. I mean, there's a lot of setup here. There's just a lot of powerful stuff you can do with this library. And then also just beyond Hypothesis, just showing an example here of stepping into your code, setting a breakpoint, and then just using PyTest as an entry point to just dive right into the function that you're working on logic with so that you can test just that logic, play around with just that logic, and you're not having to go to the UI and press a button and trigger an effect and then see what it prints out to the console. By using PDB statements and PyTest, you can step right into the logic that you're working on and play around with it and quickly figure out what's working, what's not working, set up different test scenarios, and use testing as a way of working through the problem that you're trying to fix. And oftentimes we call this test-driven development. You write the test first, and then you start messing with your logic until it does what you want it to do.
Future Ed here. So I wanted to make a couple of comments on some things that I had said, and then take the conversation a little further. So one thing was breakpoints. I mentioned PDB, and this is sort of an older style of setting breakpoints prior to Python 3.7, which came out in 2018. This was the main way that you would set a breakpoint in Python code, unless you had an editor that lets you click a little dot and then set a dot breakpoint in your code. But if you wanted to type it in, you would do it this way. Starting with Python 3.7, there's now breakpoint as a function that you just have built in. So I would obviously encourage you to use that instead. You shouldn't ever really need to use the PDB statement anymore, so that's old style. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about further was test-driven development. So I mentioned it briefly. Classic test-driven development would be writing the test first, expecting it to fail, and then working on the logic until the test passes again. And there's a lot of rigid ways to think about testing, and one of the things I want to do in this video is encourage you to think of different ways to use these testing tools. So here's an example of a test, and this is testing password reset. But this password reset has a couple of things going on. So we are setting up a secret, which we're setting, and that's because this app has multi-factor auth. And so as part of password reset, the user is going to get an email. So we have to generate an email, which means an email gets fired off. They have to click the link in that email. And then after they've gotten into the system, then they have to put in a one-time code that they get generated or sent with them. I think in this case, text messages. And so that's a lot. And if you're testing that, to manually test that is kind of a pain. And so the nice thing about kind of taking a bit of a test-driven development approach is not necessarily setting up test cases that you mean to be automated, but if for no other reason than if you want to inject yourself into the middle of this process to debug a little bit of specific logic and not have to worry about everything else, I can now set a breakpoint here for that. So one thing you'll notice here, if you look closely, is you'll see this cap log. So cap log is another feature of PyTest, and it allows us to grab whatever gets sent to the console logs. So one of the things I've set up here in this app is that, and this is part of Django, so for the emailing backend with Django, normally when this app is running, that email backend is going to send off an email. But there's a way you can set it to have it go to the console instead. So you do password reset, and when we generate the email, that email content gets logged to the console. So then in the test here, I can go inspect the console, go find this string, split on that, grab the whatever comes after it. So what comes after this confirm is going to be the credential, this little credential that we would have emailed as part of the email, which would have been that button that they would click. Do some more splitting, grab the first thing, and now we have that little credential. So now I can then use the client. So the client is another fixture, and that allows us with Django REST framework to test the API of the backend directly from our test. And so in this case, then we can grab that credential, set up a post call to the URL backend endpoint for where we do password reset. And so now I could set a breakpoint in the middle here and intercept that and see what this looks like, validate it. I can step through this code in a more fine-grained way. Here we're going to assert that we get a 200 response, but then we can then go test the one-time code, the MFA, multi-factor auth, and test that flow as well. And so really this gives you a lot more power as an engineer than to step into right where you need to be in the code and not have to do a bunch of manual testing. Now, sometimes you do want to do some manual testing. So in this case, let's run Shell Plus. So Shell Plus is a utility available via the Django extensions Python package, which I've put down here for reference some of the things I'm talking about in this talk. And that'll drop you into a Python REPL. And from here, you can do user.objects.count and any other commands you want. You'll see users already available because it pre-imports a lot of things from Django and just makes it easier to work with your data. So with this power, you can do things like freeze time, and we'll say 1900-0101. And then I can do user.objects.create email equals e@e.com. And now we can do actually go up a couple lines, user.objects.count. We have 3 users now. Now if I go to the Django admin and I hit refresh here, you'll see now that user exists, and look, they were created in 1900. And the reason why something like this could be super powerful is when I'm doing regular work, like I might have a model set up. In this case, I've got an abstract base model that adds some things like ID, created, last edited to all of my models. Well, created is an auto now true field. You can't edit this from the Django admin. If I had needed a user who has had a certain age to their account, I can do that, and I don't have to do anything special in order to get an account like that. Oftentimes, I will also use this for creating up test scenario data where maybe I've got some data from last month and this month. So if I'm testing some paging logic where you've got multiple things and multiple times, it's easier to like spread out that data because you're able to manipulate time in that way, which is a super valuable thing to do. Don't just leave this in a shell REPL. So this can be a great way, dropping into a Python REPL, to get some quick testing or to quickly debug something, to work out some prototype logic. But often I find once I've spent enough time in the REPL, it's much better to create a test for that. For one thing, if I exit out of this right now, I've now lost it all. I'd have, if I did this with statement and I had multiple lines here and I made a mistake on one of the lines, I'd have to redo the whole thing. Oftentimes I find it's much easier just to set up a PyTest, and then you can just then run PyTest-K on that test to drop right into that logic and then experiment with your code from there. Oftentimes I'll even write full experimental code in a test first, rapidly iterate on it, and then when I'm happy with it, then go move that code into wherever its permanent home is going to be. That also means you can set up creation and teardown. So I just created a user here, but now this is a junk user. So maybe I don't want to do that. And now I have to sit here and manually delete them. Well, if you set up a test scenario, you can run those lines of code and then also then just delete that user immediately after. I actually recently did that for a AI chatbot that I was working on for a client, where I had it set up so I could use a Python manage.py, which is another cool tool you can do. So Python server manage.py talk to AI would be the command. So you can go look up how to make a Python management command. But I had that set up as a while true loop, and it would loop forever, and it would just ask me what message do you want to send, and it would send it. And as part of that back and forth with the AI, some of that data was getting saved to a database. Well, again, if you're testing, you want to clean up that data. Well, as all part of that management command, I had it so that when you were done chatting and you finished, it would delete the user, which would then delete all the user's data and clean everything up. And when you would drop into that management command, it would create the user first, then let you have the conversation. And so it made it for very rapid prototyping of code. Now, one final thing I'll call out is another interesting thing you can do. In ConfTest, you may have seen that I was using a fixture here, use requests. So this is a fixture I've added in many places called mock requests. I use it on a lot of my projects. And basically anytime any code from any test, if a test calls some code and that code tries to call the internet, it'll yell about it. Now in this case, it's requests. Probably should be URL lib2. I think I should probably rewrite this at some point, because under the hood, I believe the request library uses URL lib2 to make its calls. But in any case, this is basically a fixture that says, hey, if any code, when we're writing a test, if we're running a test, if it tries to call the internet, yell about it. And so that means then you don't end up in accidental situations that many of us have been in, where you've written a test, that test gets run all the time, it gets run on CI/CD, and oops, it's making calls to the internet and sending emails or doing things we don't want it to do. Well, in this case, I needed this decorator, so I added a use requests decorator that allows it to bypass that. So instead of blocking requests, it allows for it. And the reason why that's needed is because when you generate an HTML email, it has to pull in some CSS files and some JavaScript, which it gets from the internet, and so that uses requests. But at least now with this decorator here, I know, hey, this test needs to make calls to the internet for some reason. And now I'll be a little bit more cautious in working with it, and that's because it's working with email logic. You can use these testing tools outside of just a strict test that you've written. And then you can also use them in other ways just to like kind of work with your logic, massage your logic, and get things to where you want them to be.